Hello there, one and all, and thank you very much indeed for tuning into episode 465 of Love at First Scent, live on YouTube as always. And you can tell from the format, you can tell from the video description that we have got an interview for you. I told myself that I must stop saying that I've got a very special interview because I described every single interview as being special. But if I could sort of say special to the power of 10, then I would use that term to describe today's interview and today's interview subject, because it really, really is wonderful to be able to have this particular person in the interview chair again, because it was just over a year ago that the perfume legend himself, Mr. Michael Edwards, gave us some of his time. But that was to sort of give us a bit more of an overview into his career. If you're not aware, and if you're not aware why you're not aware, Michael Edwards is the perfume guru par excellence. He is the reason why we have the fragrance wheel. He is the reason why we have books from the Fragrances of the World series that classify perfumes, that put perfumes into different categories. He is also the reason why we have one of the most revered, beloved, respected perfume books of all time, Perfume Legends, which incidentally a few years ago was revised and reissued as Perfume Legends 2. And he is now the author of this weighty and very, very impressive, highly readable, highly enjoyable tome called American Legends, which is the sort of companion piece to Perfume Legends. Perfume Legends, you may remember, covered French feminine perfumery. American Legends covers American perfumes, both masculine and feminine. So here to talk about American Legends and anything else you may like to throw at him. Hint, by the way, these are some of the Perfume Legends. So if you'd like to ask him about any of these, it's a very, very Lauder heavy display we've got here, but there is a reason for that. So if you'd like to ask him questions about any of these scents, about the book, about his work, start saving up. But for now, please say a very, very warm Persolaise welcome to none other than Mr. Michael Edwards himself, live from his beautiful Paris home. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Darius, you flatter me. To all of you out there, hello.
It's not flattery though. This is quite some tome, and even though it is very, very weighty and very, very detailed, I enjoyed reading it from cover to cover. Now, for those of you who are aware of Perfume Legends, I think, Michael, it's fair to say that the book is structured in a very similar sort of way. The chapters go perfume by perfume. And then we have subsections for each perfume. We have a little bit on the context and the background. We have something about the scent itself and its creation. And then we have another subsection, which you've called the bottle, but also it's as much to do about the marketing and the presentation as it is about the bottle. Now, given that the book follows a similar sort of structure, given that when you were writing it, your reputation was already secured, given that the people that you would have been interviewing would have been well aware of Perfume Legends, the original book, did all of those factors make this one somewhat easier to write?
I wish it were, but no, because American Legends started around about the same time that I first thought of Perfume Legends. That was back in the early 1990s. I'd become fascinated by the history of perfumes. So many of the stories contradicted each other. And I came up with this idea of writing a little booklet, nothing more, on these stories. And I thought it would be fun to talk to the great perfumers, see if they were willing to comment on those stories. But one thing led to another, and it was Guy Robert, my mentor, the great master who created such fragrances as Madame Rochas, Calèche, many of the early Gucci ones, and Monsieur Rudnitzer, Edmund Rudnitzer, probably the most celebrated perfumer of the last century. Those were the two who I couldn't be more grateful. Somehow I clicked with them, and it was they who introduced me to the over 250 people that I finally interviewed. Without those introductions, I doubt that half of them would have agreed to see me. These were the heads of houses, the couturiers, these were the bottle designers and the perfumers. But at the same time, while I was working on the French edition, I had in mind the American. And one of my earliest interviews was with Josephine Catapano, the American perfumer who created Fiji by Guy Laroche. That's why I wanted to see her. But she'd also created Youth Dew by Estee Lauder and Norel.
Mm-hmm.
great 1968 fragrance that changed American perfumery. And so my work was way back then. Um, were they willing to talk with me? Well, remember that I was classifying fragrances. I think they thought it a little bit funny, but I would pop in to talk about their fragrances, to check my classifications, and they put up with me, and they were willing to talk. Now, remember, this seems surprising today that perfumers are the stars, but back when I started, they were not, Darush. They were invisible. The brands did not acknowledge them. Yes, Monsieur Rudnitska, Guy Robert, they were acknowledged, but very few others. Even Jean-Claude Helena was just emerging in the 1970s, for example.
So the challenges were as great, the research challenges were as great as they were for writing the original book?
Well, they were great in the sense, why should anybody want to talk to me?
Because you're Michael Edwards. I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Nowadays, but not then. I was just a little fella who was asking.
No, I mean now, when you were doing is a lot of the content based on older interviews as well?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I continued interviewing in the 90s and then probably up to about 2005. The book, the interviews were probably largely concluded by about 15 years ago. But again and again set out to write them and have to put it off because of the explosion of fragrances that occurred. You know, if I just go back to put this into the horrible context, in the 1970s, we had just over 380 new fragrances. The 1980s, we went over 700. In the 1990s, over 2,000. In the first decade of the new century, it had popped up 4 times, over 8,000. Second decade, over 26,000. And we got waylaid with our basic job of classifying. It was COVID that really helped me. That gave me the time.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think a lot of writers, funnily enough, benefited from COVID. Okay, lots and lots of comments coming in. I just need to say, share this one from Paolo, a regular viewer, who says, Michael Edwards, the calming and soothing voice of the perfume world. It's great to hear him one more time. Thank you very much, Paolo. Now, I know a lot of you watching will have questions to put to Michael. If you want to sort of start typing them in the live chat, and then at various points, I'll put them to Michael. And you know, personally, I love to know where it is that you're watching from. So if you would care to share where it is that you're watching from, it's always interesting to find out. Now, honestly, it's very, very difficult to know how to get into this interview, Michael, and because there are so many starting points, there are so many ways we could get into it. I wasn't even sure up until the last minute whether to put this interview, this episode into my Love at First Scent series of videos or into my masterclass series of videos, because talking to you is as much an education as it is a pleasure. But I thought, no, this is sort of, let's make it about you as much as it is about anything else. There are so many characters who come through in your book. Even though the chapters go perfume by perfume, certain figures keep appearing and reappearing. Yes. Some of them are very well known to us. Obviously, Estee Lauder herself, her son, Leonard Lauder, her daughter-in-law, Evelyn Lauder, various other figures whose names are fairly familiar in the perfume world, Anne Gottlieb, for instance, but some, I dare say, less familiar. Now, there is one person called Ernest Shiftan, whom you call the father of American perfumery, which is quite a claim to make. And I know when you and I met up on Friday for a little pre-chat about this interview, you told me some fascinating things. So tell us a little bit about him. Why do you consider him to be the father of American perfumery?
Because he was the mentor behind so many of the great American perfumers, Sophia Grossman, Carlos Benaim, Josephine Catapano, you name it. Mr. Shiftan was trained in Austria before the war, Second World War. He became a perfumer because he liked the smell, he once said. And he joined a couple of chemical companies, but then went out on his own as a consultant. When the Nazis came into Austria, he left for Paris. When they came to Paris, he went down to the south of France. He was imprisoned by the Nazis in a concentration camp near Nice, but he escaped and made his way to America. France's loss was America's gain. Remember, this was a different time. The perfumers knew each other. They swapped formula right around the world there. And he joined the company that was to become IFF. Well, Guy Robert, my mentor, once talked of Ernest Shiftan. He said he was the perfumer's perfumer. He had this rare ability to look at other perfumers' work and pick out the good spots and encourage them to work on that. He also was not short of chutzpah. He approached the Wertheimer brothers, who owned Chanel. They had also come to America. And of course, Chanel No. 5 and the great Chanel perfumes could not be produced during the war there. And he proposed to make them. No, said the Wertheimers, we never reveal our formula. I have it, he said, and he did. And by the end of the war, he was making most of them. So,
and sorry to interrupt, Mike. Do we know how we had the formula for Chanel No. 5?
Well, I've got one. I mean, these were hawked around the place. Have I got the right one? I doubt it.
Okay. But they were happy with what he made for them anyway.
Oh, totally. By the end of the war, IFO were making most all of the great French perfumes in their laboratories in New York.
Okay. But anyway, I interrupted you. So he carried on. He started making Chanel No. 5, as you do.
And he was the mentor behind so many of the great American perfumers. He was the mentor.
And he had a very close relationship with Estee Lauder herself, didn't he?
I once asked Mr. Lauder, Leonard Lauder, who was it who was so close to your mother, who intrigued and encouraged her interest in perfume? He gave me 2 words, Ernest Shiftan. The book is dedicated to the 3 architects of modern American perfumery. For me, Ernest Shiftan, the magician, Estee Lauder, and Annette Green, who was the fountain of the Fragrance Foundation, really made fragrance visible to ordinary Americans.
And does Ernest Shiftan have any perfumes in your book that are directly credited to him? Because he was so generous with giving opportunities to other perfumers.
No, the only one would be White Linen. The story of White Linen is that Mr. Shiftan had asked Sophia Grossman if she would work on a joy interpretation. Make it inexpensive was his requirement, as every perfumer says about joy. And she had shown him her work. He liked it. At that time, he was working on an aldehyde accord based on Capricci, the Nina Ricci fragrance. And he was looking for somewhere to hang it. And he took this joy interpretation that Sophia had created, plugged the 2 together, and that was the basis of White Linen. In the book, though, you'll find the fascinating story that I'm not going to tell you online about how Mrs. Lauder and the tug of war with Ernest Shiftan over how she discovered White Linen.
Because Estee Lauder, even though she wasn't a perfumer, she wasn't a chemist, she knew what she wanted when it came to perfume, didn't she?
To me, she was every bit the perfumer.
Interesting. Okay.
She was not a perfumer. She had no training. But if you look at the private collection chapter, you'll see Vincent Marcello talking about why she refused to accept a trial after trial after trial, and she wouldn't tell him why. It just really was not what she was going to say. And he kept on saying, Mrs. Lauder, please, if you don't tell me why you don't like it, what it is that's disturbing you, I don't know how to correct it. Finally, she said very quietly, it's hospice. He said, hospice? Yes, she said. And she was right. In one of the molecules, there was a derivative of horse urine. That was
and she detected it.
Her nose. I mean, for me, she was a most remarkable woman. We haven't seen, we saw Elizabeth Arden in the 1930s, and we saw Rubenstein. Rubenstein was skincare, but then came Estee Lauder. I mean, Youth Dew, her first fragrance, was a gift to her from Josephine Catapano. She was new to fragrance. She was into skincare at that stage. In 1950, she'd created a range of pricey skincare called Estoderm Youth Dew. And 3 years later, she added a bath oil. I remember Guy Robert telling me when I spoke about Youth Dew, he said, she's crazy. Why come up with a bath oil and not a perfume? But the French never understood the difference between the American women and the French women. The French women accepted perfume. The American women, though, would not buy their own fragrance. Fragrance was a gift. They
Mm.
wouldn't buy it any more than they would send themselves a dozen roses at Valentine's Day, for example.
Mm.
And Estee Lauder was the first to put her finger on the problem. She said, perfume's a gift. That's what's killing it. And that's why she came out with the bath oil. All she knew was that she wanted that to be so potent. Well, it got to be so potent. Josephine Catapano pushed and pushed and pushed. It got to a stage of concentration. It could no longer be dissolved in regular bath oil. It had to be done in an insoluble oil, which literally the drops floated on top of the bath.
Yeah.
Marvelous scent. A woman got out. There was a scented bath stocking on her body. A signature that night, a trail the day after, and a hint the day after that. In a world of perfume pussycats, used to you as a tigress. And that was what
Absolutely, and the bath oil is still a pretty potent stuff.
it is indeed.
Now, you've made this sort of subdivision between American perfumery and French perfumery by virtue of the fact that you've given us these two books. It's difficult to generalize. It's difficult to classify, but you are a classifier. You are a taxonomist. What would you say, if anything, are the sort of main defining features or distinguishing features between French and American perfumery?
Very interesting question you ask. Firstly, to the French, perfume is an art.
Okay.
They revere it in the same way as music, opera, painting. It evolves. Think of the top note, that subtlety. Alert yourself to the theme coming through in the heart as the chords of the bass evolved. To the Americans, perfume is money.
Okay.
Form direct. It was Mrs. Lauder who said, people don't like something that changes. And so Karen Curry, who worked with her since 1982, would always say that Mrs. Lauder insisted that what you smell in the top note should also reflect a hint of what's in the base note, what people will end up with. I remember talking to Anne Gottlieb about white linen.
Talking to Anne Gottlieb about white linen.
Yes, forgive me, my throat was just sore. Let me just get
Don't worry. Have a drink. Have a drink.
Forgive me, not white linen. Talking to her about eternity.
Oh, okay.
Eternity started with Sophia, who'd taken a fantasy Frisia record and put it on top of a white rose note. And I remember Anne Gottlieb saying to me, and there the fun starts. She said, perfume in America, to be memorable, it has to have cleavage. And I always remember trying to understand what cleavage meant in an American perfume. She said it has to have a bosom. If there's no bosom, then there's no memory. Well, I was brought up on Playmate of the Month from Playboy, so that was pretty familiar to me. But I still couldn't quite get the grips at it until she said, when you look at many American fragrances up close, they're a little bit harsh because they use ingredients that are harsh to start with. But in the air, they're gorgeous. And that's the difference with American fragrances. And I think she summed it up beautifully.
So if I can sum it up, you're basically sort of saying that it's because of the American style and the American taste that we have now got what we would call linear perfumes, I suppose. And I think, am I right that Pleasures, as well as Estee Lauder Pleasures, is held up as one of the sort of first big linear perfumes? But this business of something that is more overtly sexual, that's an interesting one that I kind of picked up on in your book, because for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, from the outside, looking into America from the outside, Europe seems to have this idea that American scents need to be super clean and super sterile in order to be successful in America. And yet history would appear to suggest that that is not the case at all, that if anything, a lot of very successful American scents have been quite a bit filthier and dirtier than French perfumes, haven't they?
Absolutely. I think this illusion of cleanliness only came in the 1990s, probably
Okay.
as a relief after AIDS and stuff like that. And
So
remember, that ties up with the
go on.
war notes, New West Escape coming in 1990, 1991.
And then I guess then we had things like Clinique Happy, which is in your book, but Youth Dew. I mean, we all know that Youth Dew led to Yves Saint Laurent Opium, but
Absolutely.
Opium is kind of a much in a way much cleaner version of Youth Dew, isn't it?
Interesting. I'm not sure Mrs. Lauder would agree with you, but yes,
Oh,
it's an
okay.
viewpoint.
Say that again. The sound just cut out. What was that?
I'm not sure that Mrs. Lauder would agree with you, but it's an interesting viewpoint.
Okay. Okay. Well, unfortunately, we can't ask her.
Character out of Youth Dew.
There's an interesting little comment from a viewer now, another regular viewer, Euro, who says, according to Pierre Bourdon, it's the Brits that like their perfumes dirty. Is that true? Is that true?
Yes, probably.
Okay, well, it's all coming out today. It's all coming out today. Now, your book also, in relation to the scent Antonia's Flowers,
Yes,
mentions the creation and rise of headspace technology pioneered by one, is it Dr. Braja Mukherjee?
that's correct. Genie IFF.
Is there anything more you can tell us about him? Because his name keeps popping up through the book as well.
Does. He constantly spoke about the problems in perfume. He said, we go in a garden, we smell, and then we try to recreate. And we fall so far short, he said, because when we try to extract the oils from the flowers, the angels take their share. And he was the one who had this thought, how could we find a way of actually capturing what the angels had taken away? And it was Bernard Schott, the chief perfumer at IFF, who gave him the inspiration. Bernard had bought quite illegally a pot of freesia, growing freesia, through the customs into New York. He brought it from Paris. And he and Braja were looking at this one. And it was Braja who he'd heard of technology, headspace. He'd heard, it wasn't called headspace then. He'd heard of technology that where these pots were enclosed in a sterile condition, and gas was led through and extracted. And theoretically, the gas that came out would include some of the living perfume that the flower was emitting. And he thought, well, why can't I analyze it? Now, he wasn't the only one who was looking at this. Aurore Bertrand Dupont, at the same time, were exploring it. So it was a technological thing. But he's regarded probably as the father of this whole technology. And Antonia Flowers was the first fragrance that resulted from it. By the way, Antonia walked away from her business. She disappeared. I saw her 3 weeks ago at the IFF launch in New York. She's coming back, and Antonia's Flowers will be coming back.
Ah, you heard it here first. Well, maybe not first, but you certainly heard it here. Antonia's Flowers is back. Any fans of that perfume out there? Are there any brands or perfumes that were not able to make the final cut? I mean, I will ask you in a second if you don't mention this one, because there is one brand that is very much conspicuous by its absence. But is there anyone that you particularly want to mention?
I know the one you mean. It's Black Orchid.
Well, yes, because I think some people will be surprised to not see Tom Ford in here at all.
Me too. I tried so hard. But Mr. Ford was in his corporate palace, and I just couldn't knock down the doors. I tried and sent book and thoughts and ideas. I'd already done quite a bit of work with the perfumers and the people behind the scene. but I could not break through.
So just to explain to everybody then, that for you is a sort of deal breaker. If you do not get to speak to the people and hear their accounts firsthand, then the book can't, the perfume can't be in the book.
It can't be. Otherwise, I'm talking about hearsay. I mean, remember the books, the selection of the fragrances in the books. There are 3 criteria for that, and it's the same thing in Perfume Legends. Number 1, these are fragrances that introduced a note so intriguing, so new. Think of the Isoe Super that transformed a woody scent in Holston, for example, 75, that 100 other fragrances flocked to copy them. Or that introduced a technological change so important, like Antonio's flowers with headspace, that again it changed perfumery. Or they made such an impact that they created a trend of their own. Think of Charlie in 75. Before Charlie, men bought fragrance for women. After Charlie, because Charlie spoke to a generation of women who were moving from homemakers to the office, for the first time they had money, Charlie said to them, buy it for yourself. Wear it tonight. Wear it all day. Wear it any time there. Or think of Passion, for example, what Elizabeth Taylor did. Or think of CK1. Those would be the ones. So those were the selection. Now, in order to understand a fragrance, you have to understand, A, the time it was created. Fragrances are products of their time. Secondly, you have to understand and talk to the people who came up with the idea. That was Tom Ford who wanted fragrance. I had to talk to him. I was not an admirer of some of his early fragrances, from fragrances that he'd made during his Gucci days. But I thought his M7 was an amazing masterpiece. So for me, he was a genius. I have to use that word because he is. He's extremely difficult. He can be bad. He can be extraordinary. But he's done things that we'd never thought of before. But I needed to talk to him because without him, what would I have? I'd have the recollection of some perfumers who had taken his instructions. And that's why, to create these legends, I had to have access to all the people. And if they were dead, I had to have access to their archives, as, for example, I did with Chanel. Ernest Beau was dead. But that was exactly why I wanted to speak to Edmund Rudnitska, because he'd started work in 1928 and had known of that. Equally well, without access to Monsieur Beau's archives, which I eventually got after 19 months, I wouldn't have had access to the notes in his diary and things like that. And so no way that I could have interpreted his thinking. When one looks at a legend, one has to be utterly absorbed in that world. It's one of the most fascinating experiences. And then you have to put yourself out of it. And the problem with so many books on perfume is that the authors put themselves in it. And that's not.
Well, that's interesting, because that kind of leads me to my next question. Were there any personal favorites? And I mean, literally very, very personal favorites that in the end you decided you couldn't put into this book because if you were being really objective, you couldn't make them fit into those 3 criteria?
Interesting. I was thinking that I'd like to include Chloe, the original Chloe of 1975 that Lagerfeld had directed. It was a tuberose masterpiece, which built on fracas. I loved the perfumer Betty Bousset, who also did Esther. I thought her story was amazing. And I loved the story of Lagerfeld. But at the end of the day, no matter how good it was simply a twist on fracas. So I didn't include that. Were there any others?
Or could I ask you then, maybe the answer is simply that you think it didn't meet the criteria, but I was wondering as well about knowing from Estee Lauder, or would that have just made things far too Lauder heavy?
You're right. I thought that was a little too much. I thought the pleasures and beautiful were more important. Evelyn Lauder would disagree. She absolutely loved knowing. Um, I thought it a masterful interpretation of the Chypre note.
Mm.
But we see it many knowing reinterpretations.
No, that's an interesting point. It hasn't sort of generated
That's right.
any. No, that's an interesting point. That's an interesting point. Okay, we are already at the halfway point, folks. So if you would like to put some questions to Michael, feel free to add them into the chat. There are a few that have already come along. Just to carry on though for the moment, we talk about American perfumery, we talk about French perfumery, but is it fair, Michael, to use such a broad term? I mean, when we say American perfumery, do we really mean New York and Californian perfumery? Are there interstate or intrastate distinctions, definition? Are there some perfumes that, performed abysmally in some states, but only did well in a few states, and so that's what cemented their reputation? How does all that look?
Let's separate consumer from creation. If you're talking about creation, New York is the center of perfumery. You might say that New West was inspired by the Californian coast, yes, but it was made in New York. New York is where it all started. New York is where Elizabeth Arden was. New York was Charles Revson. New York was Estee Lauder. New York was Calvin Klein. It's all New York on that kind of thing. It's particular kind of fragrance. These are people who are competing one against the other in a frenetic pitch. Did American perfume, when did it become important to France? 1968 with Estee. Estee was the first American perfume that actually made the French perfumers sit up and take notice. Jeffrey Webster, the president of Revered, calls it the first American masterpiece. And, for example, French fragrances like First by Van Cleef & Arpels took part of the inspiration from Estee. It was a masterpiece. Estee Lauder changed perfumery because if you look back, yes, Youth Dew was important, but it was Estee of 68 that led to Alliage of 72, the first sports fragrance, green and glorious, originally, by the way, intended for Ungaro. But she and Ungaro had a fallout, and so it came into Lauder. Private Collection, still very hard to match. That was 1975. White Linen, still among the top sellers of 78. Beautiful. The last one on which she worked on 85. She lost her sense of smell 2/3 of the way through, and Evelyn Lauder took over. In those 17 years, Mrs. Lauder transformed American perfumery from ordinary to extraordinary. That was the genius of her at that time.
But you would say then that it is kind of very much New York centric, I guess.
Very
Okay.
much indeed.
Now, I know that you also talk about key markers in the story of American perfumery, various things that have happened throughout the decades. And I know one very, very important marker for you is a perfume that we don't talk about very much nowadays, and that's the one you've already alluded to, the Norel one.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that one? And that, because that was also Josephine Catapano, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Back in the 1960s, Norel was 1968. Back in the 1960s, American perfumery was plonk. It was a non-event, one person told me. Not in department stores, not in the great stores. Most of them had the presumption that their clients, the ladies who lunched, didn't really wear perfume. That was for ordinary Americans. And they bought their perfume at drugstores. Chanel No. 5 was a drugstore perfume. Nobody knew her as a French designer at that stage. So when Revson went into department stores full on in the 1968 with Norel, nobody anticipated that it would do anything spectacular. But it was spectacularly successful. And suddenly, the American corporate powers who'd ignored American fashion designers started to sit up and take notice. Maybe there was money in them, the hills was the perception. But when you really think of it, it was Norel's success that probably inadvertently opened the door for Estee Lauder's success in department stores, because upscale department stores were her territory. Saks Fifth Avenue was her territory. And suddenly, with the success of Norel, Saks Fifth Avenue was rather interested in fragrance. So that allowed Lauder to push through. But Norel opened the door too for American designers, the fashion designers. As I mentioned, the corporate powers had ignored them. But the baby boomers in the early 70s in America had started to become intrigued by luxury labels. And suddenly, the great department stores were moving from the center city into the malls where the baby boomers were. And that was exactly where the new American fashion designers set up shop. The French ignored this. They didn't understand what was happening for at least 10 years. And they left the field open to people like Halston and Bill Blass and Anne Klein and Calvin Klein to really make hay in those days. And that was what ushered in the age of the great American creativity. American fragrances in the 70s and the 80s dominated the world. Yes, Opium 77 was our blockbuster, the jaws of the fragrance business. But American creativity that was the dominant force. Think of Sophia Grossman's Paris, for example, of 1980. Think of Tresor. So many innovations coming from America. Today, no longer, because the French perfumers go cross-Atlantic, the American perfumers go to France.
Yes.
And it's very much close by. If we could have 4 American Estee Lauder companies, we'd have another France situation. The genius of France is that they've got all these great companies, the Coties, the L'Oreals, the Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy's. Whereas at the end of the day, in America, you have one giant luxury Estee Lauder. That's the challenge.
Yes. I'm going to take some questions from the audience, but I should also tell people how they can get hold of your book. Now, a good place to start is the fragrancesoftheworld.com website. So by all means, do go and check out that website. You will also see a link to Perfume Legends 2. I'm going to have to ask this, Michael. How would you respond to people who kind of take a short intake of breath when they see how much the book costs? I mean, I'm guessing that's reflected in what the amount of research that had to go into it, or
no, it's a reflection of what books cost these days. What was it? Firstly, there's a 20% discount if you go onto that site, so that'll save a lot. Secondly, this is more than a novel. I set out to create an MBA in perfumery. It sounds pompous, but the reality is that there is no other book in which you can actually read the words of the creators. Every other book tells you the author's opinion. Here, you've got unvarnished access to the actual creators, the couturiers, the designers, the perfumers, the visionaries behind these brands. This book was written as a documentary, a tutorial, in effect. If you want to go to Harvard MBA, how much is that going to cost you? For $120 or something like that, I give you the world.
Well, and yes, and academic books, and I think this can very much, if I may say so, it comes across very much as an academic book.
Yep.
We've got one viewer who's jumped in straight away, Tim Wilcox, who says, I just got Perfume Legends 2, gorgeous publication, worth every penny.
Thank you, Tim.
So there you are. Okay, we need to take some questions from the audience. How about I take, this is an interesting one from Jeff, who says, what advertising campaign of an American perfume product would you call legendary? So this is about an ad campaign.
Obsession, 1985. Obsession changed American marketing. Calvin Klein spent $15 million on the launch TV and press advertising, backed it with some 20 million scent strip samplers. Nobody had ever done that before. It was a time of sex before AIDS had become a real problem in America there. And Calvin Klein was looking, remember, he'd already had that board of the almost nude man on Times Square advertising the underwear. He was into sex. The original name was to be Climax. but they couldn't register it because of Lancôme's Climat perfume. And so
Ah,
Session was the one. That changed American advertising.
oh, that's a good one. We've got somebody else jumping in about price. Eric says, honestly, it's less than I thought it would be.
You're
So
very
there you go, Michael. You've missed a trick. You missed a trick there.
My question: would you buy a book and then share it among each other? Seriously,
Well, yes, absolutely. That's the beauty of books, isn't it?
happy to do that.
Rachel, regular viewer Rachel, hi Rachel, says, does your book cover the important perfumers at Coty who helped establish labs at Estee and others?
Paul, that's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure of the association in your mind between Coty and Estee Lauder. Could you just tell me what that means?
Okay, Rachel, maybe if you're still watching, you can tell us what you mean. Let's go to a question from Oriana, who says, I'd like to know, what does Mr. Edwards consider to be the driving reason for the massive increase in the number of perfumes coming out every year?
Money, 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 money.
I had a feeling you'd say that.
The reason for that is that when you look back, the 70s and the 80s were the golden age of American perfumery. In the 90s, it got tough. Bath and Body Works had come from nowhere. In the space of 7 years, they'd got almost $1 billion of sales. Their affordable luxuries were so different from most of the heavy scents of the 1980s that the brand sales suffered. At the same time, the Gulf War hit many of the brands because duty-free sales went belly up there. What was it? But at that time, if you were a marketing executive with one of those great brands, regardless of Bath and Body Works and regardless of the Gulf War, budget's a budget. So what do? You resort to discounting. But what happened? The great fragrances had to be deleted from the great department stores because people were buying stuff at the discounters, taking them to department stores and saying, give me my money back. So what did the guys take instead of those legendary brands? Hesitantly at first, they turned to the little niche brands that had emerged out of Paris. L'Artisan Parfum in 1978, and Nick Couture 1981, Matre Parfumerie Gantier 1985, Jo Malone 1990. Nobody knew whether there'd be an audience, but suddenly in America they found there was an audience. Women and men who'd become intrigued by fragrance during the Charlie generation, loved the impact of the American golden age in the 80s, and now were looking for something different. And then finally, in 2005, it all pulled together with the emergence of social media, and you and I could chat to each other. And that was the thing. Suddenly, little brands with $100,000, $200,000 could make some money. They could actually come up. Think, for example, of Le Labo with Santal 33. The two of them, they chipped in $200,000. That's all it took. That's all they could afford. And they created a brand that has been sold for billion. How many billion? You tell me. So that's why money, money, money. For me, niche fragrances aren't the nursery school of future perfumery. Most of the great brands are risk adverse. They don't want to spend all that money making failures. How much easier it is to trawl all those niche houses and say, well, this is an interesting idea. Oh, I like that particular one. Buy it up, develop it properly. Will many of them fail? Yes, at least 90% of them will fail. But out of it will come the future great brands of perfumery.
Yes, and if we have a couple of minutes, we may talk about that. And I know that for you, 2005 is another one of those very, very important markers. Now, Rachel has come back. She's saying, Veronique Coty told me that many of the great perfumers and lab techs from Coty helped to build many American labs, bringing their knowledge to build the American industry.
I think Veronique is quoting Coty family history. I'm not sure that I would agree with her on that, nor am I sure that Mr. Shiftan would agree with her on that. Certainly, Coty was absolutely vital. He was a genius. When you think of L'Oregan, he created the first Floral Oriental in 1905. It was he who created the masterpiece of Chypre Notes in Chypre de Coty, 1917. It was he, 5 years before Shalimar, created Emeraude, the modern Oriental there. But more important uh, is that he also created French perfumery. When he died, all his people left to start their own. Petitjean, for example, who had been firstly his Brazilian agent, then his president, left to create Lancôme. And Lancôme started with some skincare and lipsticks, but with 5 separate perfumes.
Mm.
Georges Beau, for example, who'd been one of his commercial directors, left to start Robert Piguet on that kind of thing. Serge Hefter-Louis, who'd been his financial director, then his president, left to join Christian Dior. That was where the impact of Coty was. But I don't see that impact in America. Where Coty came in, you may say, and I think she would talk about, for example, a fragrance like Muguet de Bois by Coty of, I think that was 1945. But that was created by Henri Robert, Guy Robert's uncle, who was then the perfumer at Chanel.
Mm.
And so that would have to be considered to be a French creation, not by a member of the Coty family.
Okay, but thanks for that anyway. Eric's got an interesting question again, saying, what do you think was the last really risky fragrance? And I suppose that means, a sort of risky release. And Eric suggests, was it Angel?
Oh, absolutely. From a commercial viewpoint, yes. From an olfactory viewpoint, Sex by Sophia Grossman.
Okay. Tell us a bit more about that one then.
No, that you're going to have to research on your own. But coming back to Angel, that was genius. It was the way it was handled. It was understood by Clarence that it was going to be risky.
Okay.
But enough understanding that if people were given time to understand it and accept it, it would work. And it is to Clarence's glory that they allowed almost 5 years of loss-making activity before they started to call in some money.
Yeah, no, and that's all down to the sort of single-mindedness of people like Vera Struby, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
People really pushing
he was the angel behind Angel.
Which perfumes would you say have been particularly I mean, and I'm talking about the perfumes in your book now. Which ones would you say have been particularly badly served by reformulation? I mean, we know that the brands, as much as possible, try to maintain the integrity of their perfumes, but sometimes it's just not
Giorgio.
possible.
I'd have to say Giorgio.
Okay. Tell us why.
Oh, it's one of the great creations. This was a fragrance that Jack Friedman, the president of Fluorescent, he put his life behind that fragrance. Gail Heyman had wanted a fragrance. In 4-letter language, she wanted something really potent. She said, I wanted to be Socko for my clients. And she dismissed suggestion after suggestion from the oil houses. And finally, David Horner, who was a consultant to Gail, found his way to Fluorescent. He'd known Jack Friedman because David had been Charles Revson's personal assistant. No, that is not a position in which you just type up mail. That's a very senior executive VP kind of position in those days. David was a financial genius. Anyhow, he said, Fred, I need a fragrance. This is to be launched at the 20th anniversary party, and that's 5 weeks away. I think 5 weeks. Fred wasn't interested. Jack wasn't interested. I mean, Georgia was a small boutique, no matter how prestigious. But David was persuasive and finally said, okay, I'll give you one, but you may not change it. David said, yeah, as you can imagine. Jack said, no change. Yeah, okay. David, no change. Finally, David accepted. And so Jack Friedman, the perfumers, equipped David with a big container of the Giorgio juice, already made up, lab samples with labels. And whenever Gail called the perfumer, because she only dealt with the perfumers, they would let David know what the instructions were. He would decant a sample from the big bottle, put a label on it and a number on it, and give it to her. And she went through 22 of those until finally she accepted the final submission. Why was that fragrance so important to Friedman? That's the question. It was originally created by Francis Camaï for Estée Lauder, a floralized youth tube. They turned it down. It was shown to Elena Rubinstein. It was shown to Marcella Borghese. Revlon considered it for Scoundrel. It was shown to Yves Saint Laurent for Paris. It was shown to others. And every time it was slightly modified. But Friedman believed in it with a passion and would never let it go. Why? He never answered that. To me, Giorgio incorporated the three key fragrances that had been so successful for Revlon that Jack Friedman had created. It had the freshness of Charlie, the tuberose of John 2, and the ambery note of Ciara. But today, it's a pale reflection.
And it's painful when that happens. Now, we've got somebody who's known to you. Thanks for that answer, by the way, Michael. Max, who's saying that this isn't a question.
Hello,
Max 40, who's saying this isn't a question. Hi, Max, by the way. How have you been? This is more of a compliment. Now, we don't need to read out what Max says about me, which is very, very kind and sweet. But he says, Michael Edwards is a walking encyclopedia of fragrance knowledge and so mesmerizing to listen to. Mesmerizing is right, Max, because I'm looking at the clock and thinking, oh, my goodness, we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. But thank you very much for that, Max. That's really, really kind.
Thank you.
Woozy says, what does Michael Edwards think of the new Estée Lauder Legacy collection? Now, this is the range that was creative directed by Frederic Malle, of course. Are you willing to share anything on that one?
Yes, I am. I'm still absorbing it.
Okay.
I'm hoping that I can evaluate it with a group of perfumers in London in June. I'm due to speak to the British Society of Perfumers. And obviously, the perfumers would love to smell something, but I can't get them the original juice from the legends that are in the book. So I've proposed the Legacy series. Is it different? Yes, it is. Is it similar? Yes, it is. From my casual look at it, because I've not had the opportunity with the launch to really get that deeply involved in it, which one do I particularly like? Azure. I thought that was a masterful interpretation of it there.
Yeah.
And so it's still a collection under review for me.
No, I think I was supposed to take it with
I wish Lauder would be more potent about it. I'm hardly picking up much promotion. It seems to be so quiet out there, and I've made that point to them.
Okay, no, that's a good point. And another comment rather than a question from Sir Siage Sniffington, who says, not a question, but I just wanted to say that for the 2 Cent Explorer events that I've attended, Michael's segments were the standout highlights for me and my wife. We could listen to him talk.
Seriously, you make my life. Thank you very much.
So we've the little tick in Max 40's box as well. Now, Michael, have you got another book in you? Are we going to get a book that covers the sense that we haven't had covered by American legends and perfume legends?
No. I'd love to
say that.
No, I'd love to say you that there will be. This is a marvelous way it's the finale. It's the marvelous way to end a career. When you think I set out to make it easy to find other fragrances that you would enjoy to wear, because there was no, the big problem then and now is that we still have no common language. Oh, we had no common language in perfume. Now, with my classification, we have a common language in that we've managed to match, together with the help of the perfumers and the brands. Don't just think it's me. We've managed to match some 50,000 fragrances. What has that done? It's allowed us to create online fragrance finders. It's made fragrances that much more understandable. My work is done. My work is being used in fragrance finders around the world, whether it is Wiki Parfum, Macy's in the United States, or Ulta, whether it is Boots in the perfume shop in the United Kingdom, whether it is the Sephora trial fragrance we've done, Douglas in Germany, Issy Paris in the Benelux, Notino out of Poland, whether it's Tmol out of China. That's done. The next project was the MBA in perfumery, the text of Perfume Legends, now updated, and American Legends. I think that's an elegant career. I've done what I want to do. I hope somebody else will pick up those, and I hope that they'll add to American Legends. I hope they'll add to Perfume Legends.
My question wasn't in any way meant to intimate that you hadn't done enough, but I just think, it would be so good to get your take on. But yeah.
It's so kind of you, but I think probably for the next 4 or 5 years, I may not look it, but I'm old now. And for the next 4 or 5 years, I suspect I'm going to be talking and lecturing. I love interacting with people like you guys. It's a real pleasure.
Well, maybe what you actually need to do is a series of chats on this channel where we can chat about Abbey Rouge and Guerlain Vetiver and Amouage Gold, which I know is one of your favorite perfumes. And
yes, absolutely.
I have just got one final one up my sleeve, but I will just say thank you very much to everybody for watching. Thank you very much for tuning in. Michael, congratulations. I should have said at the very beginning, congratulations on the publication of this book and the writing of it. It is really, really a work. I'm also going to try and lift up, just in case people haven't been aware, this is what Perfume Legends 2 looks like at the moment. Don't they make a handsome couple? And this has had, it was 8 new legends added, wasn't it?
That's correct, yes.
Yes, I think so. Do check those out. We cannot thank you enough for all the work that you do for the perfume industry, Michael, and there are hundreds of thousands of people around the world who don't even know that they ought to be grateful to you, but that they should be, because
guys, if you permit me to say, it's so kind of you to say that, but it's me who must thank all you guys.
Well, we get to thank you today.
Seriously, you've given me such pleasure in doing all this. I've met such fascinating people, and to have people like you reacting so emotionally to my work, I don't think that you can really understand just how much I appreciate it and how much I value. To all of you, thank you, and to you, Darren, thank you again.
That's very, very kind. And let's leave with a little bit of a prediction game. This is a question from Yura, who says, what do you think will be the perfume legends of the next 50 years? You can pick just one or two, but what's a perfume that, is in neither of your books, but that you think in 20, 30, 40 years time we'll still be wearing?
Baccarat Rouge.
Baccarat Rouge 540. I suspect you're right, much as my heart sinks to think I've gone on record as saying I'm not the world's biggest fan, but its influence is extraordinary, no question.
And you see, we don't create the legends; it's people. Yeah. Other people create the legends.
No, I suspect you're right with that one. Yeah, I think Baccarat Rouge 540. And I wonder, I don't know if you've had a chance to smell it, I wonder if something like, for example, Marc-Antoine Barrois' Ganymede or Amouage's Guidance, I wonder if they're sort of legends.
Say that Guidance is at my top. In case you asked the question, which new fragrances had I smelt that I like? Guidance, which if I recall was about January 2023. I really like that one there. Yeah, and the other one is Frederic Maule's Heaven Can Wait. I like that floral, woody, spicy note.
I'm so glad you mentioned that one, because I was a big fan of that one too. I think maybe a touch too retro, but I loved it. Anyway, okay, so you heard it here first, folks. Baccarat Rouge 540, Francis Kirkjohn's standout hit. Michael, thank you very, very much indeed. Hope we'll be able to get you back on the channel before too long. But for now, congratulations and enjoy the dividends that, and I don't mean just financial dividends, that the book will hopefully yield. All the best. Thank you.
Goodbye.